The wagon wheels creaked in slow agony as they rolled into the ranch yard, scattering pale dust across the dry ground. The sun, harsh and relentless, pressed down on Ella's shoulders like a heavy hand. She sat stiffly on the back edge of the wagon, her knuckles white around a small cloth bag. All that remained of a life she could no longer name. A man waited on the porch. His shape was tall and severe, outlined against the warped wooden boards of the house. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his eyes, but the hard lines of his jaw were visible even from a distance. He didn't move as she clambered down, stumbling on the last step. She felt his stare cut across her skin like a blade. The driver flicked the reins, and the wagon pulled away, leaving her alone in the yard. Dust hung in the air, a pale curtain between her and the world she had left behind. Ella swallowed hard, tasting grit and fear. She pressed the bag tighter to her chest, as if it could anchor her to the earth. The man didn't call to her. Instead, he turned and stepped back into the shadow of the porch, the door yawning open behind him like a waiting mouth. She hesitated. Every instinct inside her screamed to run, but her feet refused to move. Her father's voice echoed in her skull, reminding her of debts, of promises she never made but was forced to carry. When she finally forced herself forward, the boards of the porch groaned under her weight. She felt each step in her bones, each sound vibrating up her spine. At the threshold, she paused again, her breath shallow and ragged. The door swallowed the last rays of the sun, closing her inside the stale, waiting dark. The hallway smelled of dust and old sweat. A single chair stood against the far wall, its back turned as though someone had recently sat there and simply vanished. She glanced at it quickly, afraid to stare too long, afraid it might reveal something she wasn't ready to see. Behind her, the door creaked as it shut. The click of the latch sounded louder than a gunshot in the silence. She turned, heart hammering, and found the man standing just inside. His hat now hung on a nail, revealing hair streaked with gray, his eyes dark and unreadable. He said nothing. His gaze swept over her in a slow, deliberate scan, and for a moment she felt more like livestock than a person. She tightened her grip on her bag, fighting the urge to sink into the floor. Her throat tightened, a small tremor running through her arms. She wished to speak, to ask him where she should go, what she should do, but no words came. He turned sharply and started down the hallway without a word, his boots thudding heavily on the wooden boards. After a few steps, he stopped and looked back at her. His eyes didn't soften, didn't invite. They only commanded. Ella's legs obeyed before her mind caught up. She moved forward, her footsteps echoing like small, frightened heartbeats. Every inch of the house felt hostile. The walls leaned inward, the floor moaned with each step, and the stale air stuck to her skin like wet cloth. As she followed him deeper, she knew, without being told, that she had crossed a line that could not be undone. Outside, the wagon trail was already fading into a thin line of dust under the burning sky. The gate she had just passed through seemed impossibly far away. Her chest ached as if something inside had already started to break. She held her bag tighter, her only shield against the silent, waiting darkness. The kitchen felt colder than the hallway, though a weak afternoon sun pressed against its small, dirt-streaked window. The air carried a sour, oily smell, as if meals had been burned here too many times and never forgiven. A heavy wooden table dominated the center of the room, its surface scarred and pitted like a battlefield. Ella stood near the doorway, her eyes fixed on the deep scratches carved into the wood. She tried not to let her gaze wander to the other details, the dark stains on the floor near the hearth, the iron hooks dangling above the stove like patient vultures. He took a slow step toward her, his boots scraping across the rough boards. Then another. She felt each movement pull her deeper into the room, as though invisible threads tied her to him. Finally, he stopped an arm's length away. She could see the lines around his mouth now, cut deep by years of command and silence. His eyes, dark and steady, pinned her like a nail to a wall. "You don't leave the yard," he said. His voice was low, carrying the weight of unchallenged authority. Ella's throat bobbed. She managed a small nod. "You don't speak to strangers. You don't touch locked doors. You don't wander at night." His words dropped like stones, each one punctuating the stillness around them. Ella's fingers tightened around her small bag, her knuckles paling. When she didn't answer immediately, he leaned closer. The sudden nearness forced her to step back until her spine pressed against the cool plaster wall. He reached out, his rough fingers hooking under her chin, lifting her face so their eyes met. She wanted to look away, to disappear into the cracked plaster behind her, but his grip was iron. "You answer when spoken to," he said. The tremor began in her knees and spread upward, turning her breath shallow and sharp. Finally, her lips parted. "Yes," she whispered. His eyes searched her face for a moment longer, as if confirming the shape of her submission. Then he let go abruptly, and she stumbled slightly, catching herself on the wall. The sting of his touch lingered along her jaw, a brand she would not soon forget. He turned away without another word, moving toward the stove. He lifted the lid of an iron pot and sniffed, grimacing. His broad back closed her out, a wall she could not climb. Ella shifted her weight, her heart thudding in her ears. The room seemed to grow smaller, the walls bending inward. She could hear the faint ticking of a clock somewhere deeper in the house, a dry, slow heartbeat echoing her own. He banged the pot lid shut and set it aside. Without turning, he spoke again. "You'll cook, you'll clean, you'll keep the place quiet." She opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came. The words felt stuck, heavy as iron nails in her throat. Finally, she managed a small nod. He turned, watching her for a few seconds that stretched too long. Then he stepped past her, his shoulder brushing hers so lightly it felt like a threat. As he disappeared into the hallway, Ella sagged against the wall. She pressed her fingers to her chin where he had touched her, feeling the ghost of his grip echo through her bones. She forced herself to take slow breaths, tasting the stale air, each inhale a small act of defiance against the wave of panic rising inside her. Her eyes dropped to the table once more. Scattered across its surface were old knife marks, burns, and small notches, silent evidence of other hands, other lives that had passed through this place. Ella clutched her bag tighter to her chest, the thin fabric now damp with her sweat. She looked toward the hallway where he had vanished and felt an invisible gate slam shut behind her mind. Somewhere beyond the window, she could hear a crow caw once, then silence. The world outside might as well have been 1,000 miles away. She was here now. She was his now. The next morning, the first pale light pushed through the grimy kitchen window, painting thin lines across the wooden floor. Ella hadn't slept. She sat on the edge of a narrow cot in the small side room they had shown her last night. Her eyes felt heavy, her mind a fog of half-formed thoughts and hushed terror. A muffled creak in the hallway snapped her upright. She grabbed her bag instinctively, though there was nothing inside worth saving anymore. A soft shuffle followed, slow and careful, unlike his heavy boots. The kitchen door opened, revealing a thin woman with hair pulled tight into a low bun, the gray strands twisted like old rope. She moved cautiously, each step careful, as if she were walking over broken glass. Ella stood quickly, her shoulders tensed. The woman's eyes met hers, gray, sharp, but not unkind. There was a tiredness there, an echo of long years bent under the same weight that now pressed on Ella's back. The woman said nothing. She turned to the stove and began stirring a pot with a wooden spoon worn to a smooth curve. Steam rose in weak wisps, carrying a faint smell of watered-down oats. Her movements were mechanical, almost hypnotic, as though her mind worked elsewhere, far beyond these walls. Ella hovered near the doorway, feeling as though she were intruding on something private and delicate. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came. The woman glanced over her shoulder, eyes flicking briefly to Ella's trembling hands before returning to the pot. On the table, a chipped bowl and a wooden spoon sat ready. The woman ladled a thin serving into the bowl, set the spoon beside it, then stepped back without a word. Her gaze avoided Ella's completely now, fixed instead on a dark knot in the wall's wood grain. Ella moved forward hesitantly, feeling her stomach knot with both hunger and shame. She lowered herself onto the rough chair, wincing as it scraped loudly against the floor. Her fingers wrapped around the bowl, feeling the warmth spread into her palms. The first spoonful tasted like ash and water, but she forced it down. Each bite seemed to echo in the silent kitchen, the air vibrating with unspoken things. The woman resumed her slow stirring, her shoulders rising and falling in a rhythm that felt more like breathing than cooking. Outside, a sudden gust of wind rattled a loose shutter. Ella flinched, spilling a little of the watery porridge onto the table. The woman's head snapped up, eyes narrowing at the noise. Then, slowly, her expression softened, settling back into a blank mask. When Ella finished, she set the spoon down carefully, afraid to make another sound. The woman approached, took the empty bowl, and turned away, rinsing it in a basin with thin, cold water. Finally, the woman spoke, her voice low and sanded rough by years of caution. "My name is Martha." Ella's mouth parted, surprise breaking her frozen state. She searched Martha's face for something, warmth, invitation, anything, but found only exhaustion and a shadow of pity. "I'm Ella," she managed to say, her voice barely more than a breath. Martha nodded once, a stiff motion that seemed to cost her effort. Then she turned away, wiping her hands on a threadbare cloth. The door to the hallway creaked open. Heavy steps approached, his steps. Martha stiffened instantly, retreating to a corner of the kitchen like a mouse fleeing from a hawk. He entered, his gaze sweeping the room. His eyes lingered on Martha for a heartbeat before shifting to Ella. He said nothing, only watched. The weight of that look pressed into Ella's chest, flattening her breath. After a moment he crossed to the table, picked up a tin cup, and drank from it without taking his eyes off her. Then, with a slow motion, he set the cup down and turned to leave. When his footsteps faded into the hallway, Martha exhaled a breath she had been holding. She looked at Ella, her lips pressing into a thin, worried line. Then she turned back to her work, her body folding inward, closing itself against the world. Ella stood in the doorway, her fingers brushing the edge of the table. She wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but Martha's hunched back answered them all. Silence was safer. Outside, the wind died as quickly as it had come. The air inside seemed to thicken again, curling around Ella's shoulders like a damp blanket. In that heavy quiet, she felt the first threads of connection to another soul in the house, fragile, hidden, and dangerous. But it was something. And for a moment, that small spark kept her standing. The days blurred together like dust storms on the prairie, silent, choking, endless. Ella moved through the ranch house as if she were a ghost, haunting her own body. Each morning began with Martha's quiet movements in the kitchen and ended with the man's heavy footsteps echoing through the halls. The air inside the house felt stale, always heavy with something unspoken. Every floorboard creaked as though protesting her presence. Even the wind seemed to avoid the narrow windows, slipping past without stirring the thin curtains. In the evenings, she noticed small details that gnawed at her mind. There was a ledger tucked behind the stove, its spine cracked and stained. Once, when Martha left the kitchen to fetch water, Ella moved closer to it. She ran her finger over the rough leather, her heart thumping in her ears. She didn't dare open it, not yet. On the far wall, a door remained shut at all times. Its lock glared at her like a dark eye. Sometimes at night she thought she heard a faint rattle behind it, as if something or someone shifted inside. But when she pressed her ear to the wood, she heard nothing but her own quick breaths. At dinner, the rancher rarely spoke. He ate methodically, each movement controlled and deliberate. His fork scraped against the metal plate in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Occasionally his eyes would drift to Ella, pausing on her hands as they trembled or on her lips when she chewed too slowly. She forced herself to look down, to keep her hands steady. Her stomach twisted into tight knots, making each bite feel like swallowing iron nails. Martha sat at the far end of the table, her eyes always downcast, her hands folded neatly in her lap when not serving. She moved with an eerie grace, like she had learned every creak and moan of the old house, and memorized how to move without angering it. One evening, as the last light sank into the dry earth outside, Ella lingered at the sink, scrubbing the plates. The water was cold, numbing her fingers, but she welcomed the sting. It felt like a small punishment she could control. She glanced at Martha, who stood by the stove, drying her hands on a rag so thin it looked like it might dissolve. Martha's eyes flickered toward the closed door for a moment, her mouth tightening before she turned away. Ella followed her gaze, her pulse spiking. The door seemed to lean toward her, pulling at her curiosity and dread in equal measure. She forced her focus back to the plates, scrubbing harder until her knuckles turned red. When the dishes were done, she stayed by the sink, staring into the murky water. Reflections wavered on the surface, her own hollow eyes, Martha's slumped shoulders, the edge of the table where he usually sat. She felt like a thin sheet of glass, fragile and always on the verge of shattering. Every glance from him, every small noise from the locked door, every silent movement of Martha's hands felt like another crack spreading across her surface. Late that night, after she had crawled into her narrow cot, she lay listening. The house breathed around her, beams settling, a loose shutter knocking in the wind, a distant owl calling out into the darkness. Then something else. A faint scuff against the floorboards. Her breath caught. She strained her ears, her body stiff as iron. The sound stopped, replaced by a long, empty silence. She curled deeper under the thin blanket, pressing her face into the rough fabric. Her heart thudded in her throat, loud enough she feared it might call attention to her hiding place. In the morning, she found Martha already in the kitchen, her face even paler than usual. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them grew thicker, pressing at Ella's temples until her head ached. She wanted to ask about the door, about the ledger, about the sounds at night, but each question weighed too much, a stone tied to her tongue. The rancher entered without a word, brushing past Ella so close that her shoulder nearly collapsed under the weight of his presence. He poured himself water, drank, and then paused, looking at her over the rim of the cup. His stare cut through her like a dry wind slicing through thin cloth. She looked down at her hands, clutching a dish rag so tightly her fingers cramped. He set the cup down and left the room, his steps echoing long after he was gone. Martha turned then, her lips parted as if she might say something, but she stopped herself, shaking her head almost imperceptibly. Ella's breath trembled out of her, her ribs tightening painfully. The questions roared inside her skull, but she swallowed them down, one by one, like bitter medicine. Outside, the sky stretched pale and endless, but inside the walls of the ranch house there was no horizon. Only the steady tightening of invisible chains she had not yet learned to count. That morning felt colder than usual. Ella lavó los platos en silencio, sus dedos crudos de tanto fregado. Martha moved around her like a shadow, never quite meeting her eyes. When the rancher entered, he tossed a small leather pouch on the table. The sudden noise startled Ella. She turned too quickly and knocked over a metal cup. It clattered to the floor, echoing in the tense air. Her breath caught in her throat. He stepped toward her slowly, his eyes fixed on her like a hawk watching prey. She dropped to her knees before he could say a word, scooping up the cup with trembling fingers. "On your knees," he said softly, though she was already there. Her hand brushed a sharp shard of porcelain hidden in the water. Pain shot up her arm, blood blooming on her palm. She bit her lip, fighting the urge to cry out. When she finally set the cup back on the table, he turned away without another glance, as though she were a piece of broken furniture. She stayed on the floor, her blood mixing with the soapy puddle. Martha knelt beside her silently, wrapping the cut with a strip of torn cloth. The woman's touch was rough but gentle, her face set in a hard mask. When Martha finished, she stood and left without a word. Ella sat alone, cradling her bandaged hand to her chest. She felt her world shrink further, the walls pressing tighter around her. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Inside, the silence swallowed her whole. That night, the moon hung above the ranch like a pale, watchful eye. Ella lay on her narrow cot, her mind racing. The cut on her hand throbbed with each heartbeat, a reminder of the day's humiliation. She rose slowly, every board beneath her feet threatening to scream. She held her breath, inching down the hallway, clutching her shawl tight around her shoulders. The front door stood ahead, so close she could almost taste the cool night air waiting beyond it. Her fingers shook as she reached for the latch. It didn't budge. She pulled again, her breath quickening. Then a sudden cold grip on her wrist. She turned, heart hammering. He stood behind her, his face a mask of shadow, his eyes catching the moonlight like a predator's. Without a word, he yanked her back inside, his fingers digging into her arm. She stumbled, her shoulder hitting the wall. The pain flashed bright, but she bit it back. He dragged her down the hall, each step echoing like a heavy drumbeat. At her room, he shoved her inside, the door slamming shut with a final, hollow thud. She collapsed onto the cot, breathless, her entire body trembling. The lock clicked outside, a small sound that felt louder than thunder. In the darkness, she curled into herself, pressing her bleeding hand against her chest. A single tear slid down her cheek, disappearing into the thin blanket. Outside, the moon watched silently as the house swallowed her again. Morning light crawled across the kitchen floor, painting long stripes on the walls. Ella sat at the table, her bandaged hand resting in her lap. Her eyes felt heavy, her thoughts stuck on the locked door and the cold grip on her wrist. Martha moved around the room in silence. She paused by the stove, staring into the pot as though searching for words she didn't dare say. Finally, she stepped closer. Her voice was a whisper, so low it barely reached Ella's ears. "Don't go near the north barn," Martha said, her eyes flicking nervously toward the hallway. Ella's breath caught. Questions burned at the tip of her tongue, but she knew better than to ask. Martha's face looked pale and strained, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped a worn rag. Without another word, Martha turned away, resuming her quiet tasks as if nothing had happened. The warning hung in the air like a dark cloud, wrapping around Ella's chest. Later, when the rancher entered, the room seemed to freeze. He glanced at Ella, then at Martha, as if he could sense the shift. Martha kept her head down, her shoulders stiff. Ella lowered her eyes, trying to appear invisible. He stood there for a long moment, his boots creaking on the floor, before leaving without a sound. When he was gone, Martha dared a quick glance at Ella. The look held both fear and a fragile kindness, a quiet plea to listen and survive. Ella sat frozen, the words echoing in her mind. "Don't go near the north barn." That night, the house felt colder than ever. Ella lay curled on the rough cot, her bandaged hand throbbing under the thin blanket. Every creak of the floorboards outside her door sounded like a threat. Hours passed in heavy silence. Then she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate. The door opened. The rancher's figure filled the doorway, blocking out the faint moonlight behind him. He threw an old, thin blanket onto the floor. "Sleep here tonight," he said, his voice flat and final. Ella's mouth went dry. She rose slowly, her knees shaking. She stepped off the cot and knelt on the cold floorboards, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. He stood watching her for a moment longer, his eyes hard and unreadable. Then he turned and left, the door slamming shut. The cold bit into her bones immediately. She curled into a tight ball, trying to find warmth in the thin fabric. Her breath fogged the air in front of her face, each exhale a fragile ghost. Somewhere in the house, a board groaned under his weight. She imagined him listening, waiting for her to move or cry out. But she stayed silent. The hours crawled past. Her back ached, her fingers went numb, but she didn't dare shift too much. By dawn, she felt smaller than she had ever been. Her body shivered uncontrollably, and her mind drifted somewhere dark and far away. When morning light finally spilled across the floor, she realized she had survived the night, but at a price she couldn't yet measure. The morning came gray and silent. Ella forced her stiff body upright, every joint aching from the cold floor. Martha entered quietly, her eyes dropping to the blanket still wrapped around Ella's shoulders. She didn't speak, only left a small cup of weak tea on the table before slipping away. Ella sipped slowly, the warmth stinging her cracked lips. Her gaze wandered to the pantry. Something pulled at her, a small urge to know, to uncover the truth she felt breathing behind every wall. When Martha disappeared down the hallway, Ella stood and crept toward the pantry door. Her fingers brushed over sacks of flour and old jars until she felt something rough tucked behind a crate. She pulled out a small stack of papers, yellowed and brittle. Her hands trembled as she unfolded them. They were letters, shaky handwriting, smudged ink, words that spoke of fear, loneliness, and silent nights. One line repeated again and again, "I thought I could leave." He wouldn't let me. Ella's throat tightened. Her eyes darted to the doorway, half expecting to see his shadow there. But the hall stayed empty, the house holding its breath. She pressed the letters to her chest, her heart pounding like a trapped bird. Each word cut deeper, confirming what she had only felt in her bones. She was not the first. The air seemed to close around her, heavy and sour. She slid the letters back into their hiding place and stepped away, her legs weak beneath her. Returning to the kitchen, she found Martha staring at her, as if she already knew. Martha's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes shining with something close to sorrow. Ella turned away quickly, clutching her hands together to stop them from shaking. The walls felt closer now, the ceiling lower. She could still hear the echo of that line in her mind. "I thought I could leave. He wouldn't let me." That afternoon, Ella moved through the house like a shadow, her thoughts echoing with the words from the letters. She found herself drawn to corners she had ignored before, her eyes catching every small detail. A crack in the wall, a scratch on the floor, a forgotten hair ribbon under a table leg. Near the back staircase, she noticed a small wooden box, half hidden under an old blanket. Kneeling, she pulled it into the light. Her fingers hesitated on the latch before she opened it. Inside, she found a faded locket, its chain knotted and rusted. She opened it carefully, revealing a tiny portrait of a young woman, her eyes wide, her smile thin and fragile. Beside it lay a small hair comb and a torn handkerchief with embroidered initials. Ella's stomach turned. These were pieces of another life, someone who had come before her, someone who had hoped, perhaps even dared, to believe in escape. She closed the box with shaking hands and tucked it back where she found it. Her chest felt tight, her breath shallow. Each new discovery piled onto her growing fear, pressing her deeper into a silent panic. Later, at dinner, the rancher watched her closely. Every scrape of his fork sounded like a threat. She kept her eyes on her plate, her hands locked together in her lap under the table. Martha served quietly, her shoulders tense. When her eyes met Ella's, they held a hidden message, a quiet warning or maybe a silent plea to stay silent, to stay small. Ella forced herself to swallow the dry bread, each bite catching in her throat. The room felt smaller than ever, the walls creeping inward, the air thick enough to choke on. When dinner ended, the rancher stood and left without a word. Martha lingered for a moment, her eyes searching Ella's face. Then she turned and disappeared into the hallway, leaving Ella alone at the table. Ella pressed her forehead against the rough wood, her fingers digging into the edges of the table. In her mind, she could still see the locket, the delicate portrait, the embroidered handkerchief. Small ghosts whispering that this story had played out before. And no one had escaped. Night fell heavy over the ranch, the sky a dark blanket pressing down on the silent house. Ella lay awake on her cot, her mind replaying the letters, the locket, the girl's haunted eyes. A soft creak at the door made her freeze. Martha slipped inside, moving like a ghost in the dim light. Her face looked pale and drawn, her hands shaking slightly as she closed the door behind her. From her apron pocket, Martha pulled a small rusty key. She held it out, her eyes locked onto Ella's. "When he goes to town tomorrow," Martha whispered, her voice a dry hiss. "Take it! Run!" Ella sat up slowly, her heart slamming against her ribs. She reached for the key, her fingers brushing Martha's. The touch felt electric, a shared pulse of fear and desperate hope. Martha's eyes glistened, but she quickly turned away, wiping her hands on her apron as if to hide her trembling. "You must be careful," she said. He knows everything. He watches." Ella clutched the key to her chest, nodding. 1,000 questions burned on her tongue, but she swallowed them all. There wasn't time. Martha moved to the door, pausing one last time. Her gaze softened, sadness and fear wrapped together in her tired eyes. "You remind me of her," she murmured, almost too quiet to hear. Then she slipped out, the door clicking shut behind her. Ella sat in the dark, the key digging into her palm. Every breath felt sharper now, every small sound louder. The old house seemed to lean in closer, listening, waiting. She closed her fingers tighter around the key. For the first time in weeks, a spark of something unfamiliar flickered inside her. Not just fear, but the fragile shape of a plan. Tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow. Morning arrived slow and heavy. Ella moved carefully through the kitchen, her heart thudding with each step. The key weighed against her chest under her dress, its edges pressing into her skin like a silent promise. The rancher prepared his horse outside, the dull clink of metal echoing through the yard. Martha stood near the stove, her hands trembling as she stirred a pot that barely steamed. When the rancher finally left, the air in the house seemed to shift, expanding with a sudden fragile freedom. Ella and Martha locked eyes for a moment. No words, just a shared, shaky breath. Ella se apresuró a su pequeño cuarto. She grabbed a stale piece of bread and a small jar of water, stuffing them into a cloth bundle. Her fingers shook as she wrapped the bundle tight and tucked it under her shawl. She paused by the window, watching the dust trail vanish behind the rancher's horse. Her mouth felt dry, her thoughts loud and jumbled. Martha appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide and wet. She held out a small, tattered coat. "You'll need this," she whispered, her voice breaking. Ella took it, her throat closing. She wanted to thank Martha, to hold her, but the words stayed trapped behind her ribs. Instead, she pressed her forehead briefly against Martha's shoulder before turning away. She checked the key again, feeling its cold bite against her palm. Every sound in the house now felt magnified, the groan of a beam, the far-off crow outside, her own ragged breathing. As the sun climbed higher, she crept to the hallway, testing each floorboard with careful steps. The front door seemed impossibly far, the hallway stretching longer with every breath. Her pulse roared in her ears. She paused once more at the window, watching the sky. Then she turned back to the door, her hand closing around the key so tightly her knuckles whitened. She was ready. Tonight. Night fell like a shroud. The house settled into deep, watchful silence. Ella stood by the door, her bundle pressed against her chest. The key trembled in her fingers, cold and sharp. Every muscle in her body felt coiled, ready to snap. She listened for his return, but the yard outside remained empty, no hoofbeats, no creak of the gate. Her chance had come. She slipped down the hallway, each floorboard threatening to betray her with a loud groan. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her ears straining for any sudden noise. At the front door she knelt, sliding the key into the lock. It stuck at first. Panic surged through her, her fingers slipping. She forced herself to breathe, trying again. Finally, the lock turned with a soft click. She pushed the door open just wide enough to slip through. The night air hit her face like a slap, sharp, cold, real. She stepped onto the porch, her heart pounding so hard it seemed to shake the boards beneath her. Then, a sound behind her. She turned slowly. He stood in the doorway of the dark hallway, his figure filling it completely. His eyes gleamed in the moonlight, empty and merciless. For a moment neither of them moved. Then he stepped forward. She stumbled back, almost losing her grip on the bundle. Her mind screamed at her to run. She bolted off the porch, her feet slamming onto the dirt. Behind her, she heard his heavy boots thunder after her, closing the distance too fast. At the gate, she fumbled with the latch, her fingers clumsy with terror. His hand clamped around her arm, yanking her back. She twisted, raising the small knife hidden in her bundle. It flashed once in the moonlight before she drove it into his forearm. He roared, his grip loosening just enough. She tore free, stumbling through the gate and into the darkness beyond. Her lungs burned, her legs screamed, but she kept running. The world shrank to the dry path ahead and the blood pulsing in her ears. Tonight, she thought. It has to be tonight. Ella ran into the night, her breath tearing from her throat in ragged gasps. Each step felt like it might be her last, her feet stumbling over dry roots and loose stones. Behind her, she heard his shouts, angry, broken, echoing across the empty fields. The moonlight threw long, twisted shadows across the trail, turning every bush into a threat, every stone into a possible snare. She clutched her bundle against her chest, her fingers numb. The knife handle was slick with blood. Her own or his, she didn't know. The gate vanished behind her, swallowed by darkness. The ranch, that prison, faded into a memory made of splinters and echoes. She tripped once, falling hard onto her knees. Pain shot up her legs, but she scrambled up again, the taste of dirt sharp on her tongue. She forced her body forward, refusing to listen to the screams in her muscles. Every heartbeat drummed out a single word, "Go, go, go." A branch snapped behind her, and she turned sharply but saw nothing. only the dry whisper of the wind in the grass. Her mind spun with images, Martha's trembling hands, the letters, the locket. Each face, each secret, pressed her forward, urging her to break free. She felt the cold air slice across her skin, her hair whipping against her cheeks. For a fleeting second, she imagined she could already see the dawn peeking over the far hills. She didn't dare look back again. Her breath turned ragged, her vision blurred. She pushed on, deeper into the endless dark, away from the house, away from his reach. Tonight, she thought, her mind flickering like a dying candle. Tonight, I choose myself. Dawn crept slowly over the horizon, painting the sky in pale streaks of gray and pink. Ella stumbled forward, each step heavy, her legs shaking beneath her. She finally collapsed near a dry ditch at the edge of a field, her breath ragged and sharp as broken glass. The earth felt cold and solid against her palms, grounding her in the moment. She pressed her forehead to the dirt, her hair falling around her face in tangled waves. Tears slipped down her cheeks, mixing with the dust and blood. Behind her, the ranch was only a distant memory, a dark shape swallowed by the early light. She knew he might still be looking, that the danger wasn't truly gone. But she was no longer trapped inside those walls. She lifted her head, blinking into the rising sun. Each breath hurt, but each was hers alone. In her pocket, she felt the outline of the small locket she had taken before running. Her fingers closed around it, gripping it like a lifeline. She didn't know where she would go or how far she could make it. The world beyond the ranch felt endless, a stretch of dry, unknown land. But it was hers now, terrifying, empty, and free. Ella forced herself to her feet, swaying in the morning wind. Her body trembled, but she took one shaky step forward, then another. With each step, the weight of the ranch began to slip from her shoulders, leaving behind scars she would carry forever. She paused once more, looking back only to remind herself she would never return. Then she turned toward the rising sun, her hand still gripping the locket. A small, fragile promise that she was still alive, still herself, and she kept walking.